Did you seriously just try to correct me? You're security, not a planner. They laughed when the single dad in a pressed but modest security uniform stepped closer to the chandelier line. Said he should stick to checking wristbands and opening doors. Then the music trembled faintly above them, and he didn't flinch. Because the man they mocked understood collapse before it ever happened. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. This wasn't really about a dance floor. It was about who sees danger first, and who gets ignored. Before I show you the exact moment when her father asked him to dance, you need to understand how quickly pride can turn into silence. The laughter lingered like perfume. Sharp, expensive, suffocating. Adrian Vale stood still beneath the crystal canopy, the glow of 1,000 lights scattering across his polished shoes. He didn't adjust his jacket. Didn't argue. Didn't rise to the bait. His hand rested lightly against the earpiece at his collar, listening to the steady murmur of staff channels. He had seen this before. Different uniforms. Different ballrooms. Same tone. Celeste Marwood lowered her champagne glass just enough to look him over again. Designer silk shimmered against her shoulders. Diamonds flickered at her throat. It's decorative, she added, louder now, for the benefit of the donors drifting nearby. I think we'll survive. A few guests smirked. He nodded once. Calm. Measured. Load limits don't care about decor, he said evenly. Just keeping everyone safe. The words didn't rise above conversation level, but something in his voice carried weight, like steel wrapped in velvet. The music swelled, strings and piano. Laughter ricocheted off glass walls overlooking the city skyline. The Gala shimmered with curated perfection, towering floral installations, suspended crystal rigs, a dance floor positioned precisely beneath the most elaborate chandelier in the building. He scanned it again. Weight distribution. Suspension anchors. Slight tension variance in the left rigging cable. Tiny details most eyes never notice. Celeste turned away, already dismissing him, her attention shifting to a photographer calling her name. Make sure he stays in the background, she murmured to an event coordinator. We don't want staff hovering in shots. Staff. The word slid across the marble like something sticky. Adrian stepped back, not retreating, simply repositioning. Power never looks toward the edges of a room. It assumes the center belongs to it. He had learned long ago that the edges were where the truth lived. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. Isla. He didn't check it yet. He knew what it would say. She'd ask if he could see the skyline from inside. She'd ask if the princess dresses were as sparkly as she imagined. He'd promised to show her the ballroom before guests arrived, but traffic had stolen those few quiet minutes. He swallowed that regret. Across the room, Victor Marwood entered to a ripple of applause, tall, silver-haired, tailored in midnight black. The host moved like a man accustomed to being awaited. Conversations bent toward him. Cameras followed. His presence shifted the temperature of the room. Adrian's gaze flicked upward again. A faint vibration tremored through the rigging grid. Not visible, not audible to most, but felt. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The coordinator reappeared at his side. Mr. Marwood doesn't want disruptions, she said under her breath. Tonight's critical. Safety's always critical, he replied quietly. She hesitated, studying him now, noticing, perhaps, the way he wasn't defensive. The way he watched patterns instead of people. Celeste's laughter rang again. Clear, rehearsed, effortless. She leaned into a group of investors, recounting the overzealous guard story with animated gestures. Her words floated back in fragments. Thought the chandelier would fall. Imagine the drama. Adrian let it pass through him. He'd commanded evacuation routes under mortar fire. He'd coordinated supply chains across collapsing borders. He'd stood in rooms where decisions meant the difference between order and chaos. This was silk and crystal. Still, physics didn't negotiate with arrogance. The band shifted tempo. Guests began drifting toward the dance floor. He felt the subtle change in load as more bodies gathered beneath suspended weight. Another vibration, stronger. His thumb pressed the calm switch. Control, confirm max occupancy threshold on central grid. Static crackled. Within margin came the reply. Too quick. Margin wasn't comfort, margin was assumption. Victor raised his glass for a welcome speech. The room quieted, expectant. And above them, one of the smallest anchor bolts gave the faintest metallic sigh. Adrian's eyes lifted. The night hadn't broken yet. But it was about to. The metallic sigh lingered above the applause, too thin for celebration, too sharp for coincidence. Victor's voice carried across the ballroom, confident and warm. Tonight, he began. We celebrate vision, generosity, and the power of community. Crystal shimmered overhead as if affirming him. Adrian didn't clap. He was watching the left suspension line again. The decorative floral mass hanging near the chandelier had shifted half an inch, almost elegant in its subtlety. Almost harmless. Across the floor, Celeste caught sight of him still scanning the ceiling instead of admiring her father's speech. Her smile tightened. She leaned toward a nearby donor. He's still at it, she whispered, amused. Should I get him a hard hat? Soft laughter. The words reached him anyway. He inhaled slowly, steadying the pulse in his throat. His earpiece hummed with low chatter, catering coordination, valet updates, nothing urgent, nothing aware. Then his phone vibrated again. This time he checked. A photo from Isla. She and the sitter stood outside the hotel entrance, city lights behind them. Her message read, "Can I come inside for 1 minute? I want to see where you work." His chest tightened. He glanced toward the lobby doors. The timing was wrong. The crowd was thickening. The floor load increasing. But he couldn't deny her that small pride. He keyed the calm. Lobby security. Allow one minor and guardian to step inside briefly. I'll meet them. Static pause. Copy. Victor's speech drew to a crescendo of applause. The band swelled again, signaling the beginning of open dancing. Guests flowed toward the center like water seeking shine, and pressure increased. Adrian moved toward the lobby entrance just as Isla slipped through the glass doors, eyes wide. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing extravagant, but she held herself like royalty because she was stepping into her father's world. "There you are," she breathed, spotting him. He crouched slightly, adjusting the small tie clip she'd brought earlier. "You shouldn't be out past bedtime," he murmured gently. "I just wanted to see," she said. "It's so big." Behind her, the sitter hovered uncertainly, aware of stares from passing guests. Celeste noticed them almost immediately. Her gaze traveled from the child to the security badge to Adrian's worn leather shoes. Something flickered in her expression, calculation, then dismissal. She drifted closer, voice honeyed but sharp. "Family night?" she asked lightly. "How sweet?" Isla looked up at her, confused but polite. Adrian straightened. "Just a quick visit." "Well," Celeste said, lowering her glass, "maybe keep her clear of the main floor. We wouldn't want her under falling chandeliers, right?" The surrounding guests chuckled. Heat rose in his neck, but he kept his tone level. "We won't." Isla's small fingers tightened around his hand. She understood enough to feel the edge in the air. If you're watching this unfold, and you believe respect shouldn't depend on status, subscribe and stay with this story, because what's coming will test everyone in this room. The music shifted into something faster, More bodies pressed toward the dance floor. He felt the vibration again, stronger now, pulsing faintly through the soles of his shoes. He handed Isla back to the sitter. "Wait near the lobby doors," he instructed softly. "If I signal, you go outside immediately." Her eyes widened. "Is something wrong?" "Probably not," he said. "But we're careful anyway, careful." The word tasted like history. He stepped back toward the ballroom perimeter. Celeste was already recounting the exchange to another guest, her laughter peeling brighter than before. Honestly, the paranoia, she scoffed. It's decorative rigging, not a war zone. War zone. If only she knew. Victor descended from the stage, shaking hands, unaware of the tension threading invisibly through his masterpiece of an evening. Adrian's calm crackled suddenly. "We've got a sway reading slightly above tolerance," a technician whispered. "Might be sensor glitch." "It's not a glitch," he replied quietly. "Clear the northwest quadrant slowly. No announcements. On what authority?" Came the hesitant response. He didn't answer that. Instead, he stepped directly onto the edge of the dance floor, eyes never leaving the chandelier. Guests parted reluctantly, annoyed at the intrusion. Celeste's brows lifted. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" He didn't look at her. "Preventing a problem," he said. Above them, the left anchor bolt rotated another fraction, and this time, even a few nearby guests heard the faint metallic strain. Laughter faltered. Conversation dipped. For the first time that evening, silence began to spread, not from admiration, but from doubt. Doubt moved faster than music. The metallic strain sharpened, no longer subtle, no longer imaginary. A few heads tilted upward. A few brows furrowed. Most guests, however, clung to denial the way people do when elegance is at stake. "It's the sound system," someone insisted. Celeste folded her arms, chin lifted. Honestly, she muttered, loud enough for nearby donors to hear, "This is what happens when staff overreact." Adrian didn't rise to it. He stepped fully onto the dance floor now, posture straight but unthreatening. His presence alone shifted the rhythm of the crowd. People sensed authority even when they didn't understand its source. Into his calm, he said quietly, "Initiate soft clear. Northwest quadrant first. No alarms. Redirect traffic toward the lobby and terrace." A pause crackled back, "We'll cause panic. Not if you move like it's hospitality," he replied. "Smile. Guide. Don't rush." Two servers adjusted trays and began steering couples casually away from the left side of the floor. A pair of event staff repositioned stanchions under the pretense of improving sightlines. Subtle, fluid, controlled. Above them, the decorative floral mass swayed again. This time the chandelier's central column trembled in response. Victor Marwood noticed the shift in atmosphere before he noticed the ceiling. Conversations were thinning. Guests were glancing toward exits as if something invisible had changed temperature. He spotted the security supervisor directing movement with precise gestures and felt irritation spike. Not fear, yet he strode closer. "What's happening?" he demanded quietly. "Load imbalance," Adrian answered without turning. "Recommend temporary floor reduction." Victor frowned. "We cleared inspections. Inspections don't account for last-minute additions." A flicker crossed the billionaire's face, recognition that something had been added for spectacle. Extra suspended florals. Additional lighting. Celeste stepped between them, sharp as glass. "Dad, please, don't indulge this. He's escalating nothing." Adrian finally met her gaze. Calm. Unshaken. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "physics doesn't care about indulgence." The room felt tighter now. Warmer. The air thick with perfume and tension. A thin crack echoed overhead, louder than before. Gasps rippled outward like concentric circles in water. Victor looked up sharply. The left rigging cable jerked a full inch, and suddenly the difference between arrogance and risk was measurable. Clear it, Adrian said into his calm voice, low, but carrying steel. Accelerate phase 2. Staff began guiding guests more firmly now. Not frantic, but no longer subtle. Celeste's composure wavered. You're frightening people, she snapped. They're safer frightened than crushed, he replied. Her cheeks flushed. Across the ballroom, Isla stood near the lobby doors, clutching the sitter's hand. She could see her father's profile, steady, focused. She didn't understand the mechanics above him, but she understood his stance. It was the same stance he had when fixing things at home. The same quiet concentration. Victor exhaled slowly, recalibrating. The tremor had not stopped. It had intensified. How bad? He asked. Adrian calculated without looking away. Crowd density, suspension load, anchor stress, minutes, he said. Victor's jaw tightened. For the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the room did not have control. Do what you need, he said finally. Celeste stared at him in disbelief. Dad. Enough, Victor cut in, voice clipped. Adrian didn't gloat, didn't react. He simply pivoted into command. Band, cut music gradually, he instructed through the coordinator. Lighting tech, reduce overhead heat load. Maintenance, meet me at the northwest access point with a ladder and torque wrench. The efficiency was surgical. Guests were now clearly unsettled, murmurs replacing laughter. A woman in heels stumbled as she was guided away. A waiter steadied her. Glass clinked against marble somewhere to the right. The chandelier dipped, barely visible, but unmistakable. A collective intake of breath filled the hall. Celeste looked up at last and saw it, not imagined, not exaggerated, real. Her confidence fractured. Adrian stepped backward toward the edge of the floor, keeping line of sight on both the rigging and the exits. No running, he called calmly. Follow staff. Plenty of space. His tone anchored the room more effectively than any speech. Victor watched him, not as staff now, but as something else. The posture. The decisiveness. The absence of ego. Memory stirred faintly in the back of his mind. A boardroom years ago. A strategist who spoke in probabilities and contingencies. The chandelier jerked sharply. A single crystal strand snapped loose and shattered against the dance floor. Screams broke through restraint, and the night tipped from doubt into undeniable crisis. The crystal shattered like gunfire. For half a breath, the room froze, caught between disbelief and instinct. Then the screams began in earnest. High, sharp, uncontrolled. He felt the shift in energy the way a pilot feels turbulence before the cabin does. Eyes on me. He called, voice cutting through panic without shouting. No running, move toward the terrace doors. Staff will guide you. Another metallic groan rolled overhead, deeper this time, vibrating through the glass walls. The chandelier swayed visibly now, a slow, sickening arc. Victor stepped backward, scanning the ceiling, the crowd, the exits. How long? He demanded. Less than 2 minutes if the load continues, he replied. Celeste grabbed her father's arm. This is absurd, we can't evacuate the entire gala because of one falling bead. A second strand snapped. It didn't hit the floor this time. It grazed a guest's shoulder, drawing a startled cry and sending a ripple of fear outward like a shockwave. That was enough. Adrian moved. He crossed the floor in swift, controlled strides, intercepting a cluster of guests pressing toward the main doors. Not that way, he instructed firmly. Terrace and side exits, keep moving. His earpiece crackled with overlapping voices. Northwest clear, stairwell 2 congested, maintenance en route. He recalibrated instantly. Redirect stairwell 2 to service corridor B. Close main doors, create one-way flow. A waiter hesitated. Sir, I'm not authorized. You are now, he said, already pivoting. The authority in his tone wasn't loud. It was absolute. Victor watched, chest tightening, as the security supervisor orchestrated movement with near-military precision. No wasted motion. No panic, just control. Control Victor himself did not have. Celeste's heels clicked sharply against marble as she followed, disbelief hardening into anger. "You're turning this into chaos," she snapped. "People are watching." "They should," he replied evenly, eyes still scanning overhead. Another wrenching creak split the air. This time several guests broke ranks, surging toward the nearest exit. A brief bottleneck formed, shoulders colliding, voices rising. He was there in seconds. "Stop," he commanded, not pleading, not panicked. "You'll jam the doors, slow down." Something in his presence forced compliance. Bodies steadied. Movement regained order. Across the room, Isla's small voice trembled. "Daddy?" He turned just long enough to find her. She stood near the lobby entrance, wide-eyed but upright, clutching the tie clip he'd given back to her earlier. The sitter hovered behind, pale. Outside now, he signaled with a firm gesture. She nodded, swallowing fear, and allowed herself to be guided through the glass doors. Relief sliced through him, brief but powerful. Above, the left anchor bolt gave another violent twist. Maintenance finally arrived at the northwest access point, ladder clattering against marble. "What's the plan?" One technician shouted over the noise. He assessed quickly. "We reduce central load by 30%. Support the secondary line while I secure the primary." The technician blinked. "You secure? Do it," he cut in. Celeste stared at him as if seeing a stranger. "Your security," she said, voice cracking slightly. "You don't climb rigs." He met her gaze then, steady, unshaken despite the tremor above. "Tonight I do." Victor felt something shift inside him at that sentence. Not defiance. Competence. The chandelier dipped lower, crystals chiming against one another in a discordant cascade. Guests on the terrace pressed against the glass, watching through fear and fascination. He ascended the ladder without hesitation. Each rung carried the faint vibration of failing tension. He could feel the imbalance through his palms, through his boots, through the very air. "Torque wrench," he called down. Metal slapped into his hand. Below, Victor found himself issuing orders, not to him, but in alignment with him. "Clear that section completely," he directed staff. "Get everyone out of the ballroom." Celeste stepped back, breath shallow, watching the man she'd mocked move into the heart of danger without spectacle. He reached the primary anchor. One glance told him what had happened, an additional decorative brace installed incorrectly, shifting the distribution beyond tolerance. Arrogance disguised as beauty. "Secondary line tension?" he asked. "Barely holding," came the reply. He tightened the primary bolt incrementally, adjusting for stress transfer. Not too fast, not too slow. The margin between stabilization and collapse was razor thin. Sweat slid down his spine despite the cool air. Below, Victor's pulse hammered in his ears. He recognized this posture now. Years ago, in a glass boardroom, a strategist had outlined worst-case scenarios for structural developments. Quiet, precise, unyielding. The same calm certainty, the same refusal to be dismissed by ego. The chandelier steadied slightly, not fixed, but steadier. "Hold," he instructed. "Redistribute weight now." Maintenance complied. The rig groaned, then shifted. For a suspended second, the entire ballroom held its breath, and the violent sway eased into a slow, manageable tremor. The tremor slowed, but it didn't stop. From the ladder, he could feel the tension still alive in the metal, like a pulse refusing to die. The chandelier steadied enough to prevent immediate collapse, yet the secondary brace continued to strain against added weight. "Don't relax," he called down. "We're stabilizing, not celebrating." Below him, maintenance workers braced the support line with shaking hands. Staff guided the last cluster of guests toward the terrace. The ballroom, once deafening with music and laughter, now echoed with clipped instructions and frightened whispers. Victor stood near the edge of the dance floor, eyes locked upward. For the first time that evening, his tailored jacket hung open, tie loosened, composure replaced by calculation. He wasn't thinking about donors anymore. He was thinking about headlines. Celeste, however, was thinking about pride. "This is being exaggerated," she insisted, voice brittle. "The floor's almost empty. It's fine." A sharp metallic pop answered her. The secondary brace jolted. He tightened the primary bolt another measured fraction. "Redistribute weight now," he repeated. "Remove the floral extension on the left quadrant." A technician hesitated. That was added per Miss Marwood's direction. He didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. Victor heard it anyway. "Remove it," the billionaire ordered sharply. Celeste's head snapped toward him. "Dad, now." The decorative extension was cut loose carefully, lowered in sections. Each removed piece reduced the strain overhead. The chandelier lifted half an inch higher. The difference was immediate. He descended the ladder with controlled precision, boots hitting marble as another faint vibration rolled through the rigging, then settled. Silence spread across the ballroom. Not the performative silence of speeches, the real kind. Victor approached him slowly. The hum of emergency lights buzzed faintly overhead where the main fixtures had been powered down. "How unstable is it?" Victor asked. "Manageable," he replied. "But we need a full structural reassessment before anyone steps back under it." A thin sheen of sweat lined his temples, but his breathing remained steady. Celeste folded her arms tightly. "So that's it? We just cancel over what could have been nothing?" He looked at her for the first time since climbing down. It wasn't nothing. She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. Because she could see it now. The loose bolt head. The partially twisted cable. The fallen crystal fragments scattered like glass rain across the polished floor. And beyond the ballroom doors, guests clustered together, shaken, murmuring. The truth was visible. Victor turned toward the terrace, surveying the crowd. "Get statements," he told an assistant. "Reassure them." He hesitated, then looked back at the man standing beside the ladder. "You said inspections don't account for last-minute additions," Victor said slowly. "You were right." He didn't answer. He simply handed the torque wrench back to maintenance. If you're still here, witnessing how quickly arrogance cracks under pressure, subscribe now, because this isn't the last layer of truth tonight. The technician who had first hesitated stepped closer. "Sir," he said quietly, almost respectfully now, "where did you learn to assess structural shifts like that?" Before he could respond, Celeste cut in. Probably YouTube. A weak attempt at humor. No one laughed. The technician frowned. "No, ma'am, that wasn't improvisation." Victor studied him more closely now. The posture, the cadence, the absence of self-congratulation. Memory sharpened. "Have we met before?" Victor asked, tone shifting from irritation to curiosity. He wiped his hands with a cloth, considering the question. In a different setting, he replied. Celeste exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous. He's security." The word landed differently this time, not as dismissal, as irony. Victor's mind reached back further, a consulting session during a risky expansion. A contingency strategist who had outlined worst-case load failures in corporate builds. A man who'd spoken in calm probabilities while executives dismissed him as overly cautious. That strategist had been younger, sharper around the edges, but the eyes were the same. The chandelier above them emitted one final settling creak, and then went still. Completely still. Outside the glass, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, first responders arriving to assess a crisis that had already been contained. Contained not by wealth, not by reputation, but by someone power had overlooked. Victor inhaled slowly. "What's your name?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. And for the first time all evening, the question carried weight. The question hung between them, heavier than the chandelier ever was. He met Victor's gaze without hesitation. "Adrian," he said simply. Not the full name, not the rism, just Adrian. Celeste let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's helpful, but Victor wasn't looking at his daughter anymore. He was searching his memory, fitting pieces together. The calm authority, the language about load tolerances, the refusal to dramatize. "Adrian," Victor repeated, slower this time. Emergency responders began filtering into the ballroom, boots echoing against marble. Radios crackled. Flashlights swept across rigging joints and anchor bolts. One of them looked up at the chandelier, then down at Adrian. "Who stabilized it?" the responder asked. He did. The maintenance technician answered before anyone else could. The responder gave a low whistle. Good call on redistributing weight first. Most people would have tried locking it down tight and snapped the line. Adrian nodded once. Too much force transfers stress. Celeste crossed her arms tighter. "Well, it's handled now, so maybe we can stop acting like it was a war zone." The responder glanced at her, then back at the twisted cable. "Ma'am, another 10 minutes with that crowd density and you'd be looking at multiple casualties." Silence pressed in. Victor absorbed that. Casualties. The word didn't belong in a ballroom filled with crystal and silk. He turned to Adrian again, eyes sharper now. "You said inspections don't account for additions. How did you know about the extra load?" He didn't hesitate. "I walked the grid before doors opened. Noticed the floral extension wasn't in the original diagram. You saw that from the floor?" Victor asked. "Reflections in the glass," he replied. The billionaire's breath caught almost imperceptibly. That was it. The strategist in the boardroom years ago had done the same thing, noticed a flaw in a projected model based on a shadow angle in a rendering. Quietly, without theatrics. Celeste shook her head. "Dad, you're not seriously. Stop," Victor said, voice firm. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Emergency personnel continued assessing the structure. One of them approached Adrian again. "You military?" "A beat. Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." The responder gave a respectful nod and moved on. Celeste's expression shifted from irritation to something more uncertain. She hadn't expected that answer. The security uniform no longer looked like something ornamental. Outside the ballroom doors, guests lingered in clusters, murmuring about the near disaster. Some pointed discreetly toward the man who had climbed the ladder. Others whispered to assistants, already shaping narratives. Public memory was forming in real time. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You consulted for Marwood Developments once," he said slowly. "Structural contingency planning. You warned us about decorative overextensions on our riverfront tower." Adrian held his gaze. "Yes." The recognition landed fully now. "You left abruptly," Victor continued. "We tried to reach you." "My wife died," he said quietly. "I had other priorities. The words weren't dramatic, they were simple. But they changed the temperature of the room." Celeste looked between them, confusion overtaking defensiveness. "Wait," she said softly. "You were." Head of Logistical Risk Assessment, Victor finished for her. The title hovered in the air like a suspended truth. Around them, staff moved cautiously back into the ballroom perimeter, awaiting instructions. The chandelier remained still, but no one dared step beneath it yet. Adrian glanced toward the glass doors, where he could see Ela peering in from outside. Even from a distance, he could read the question in her eyes. "Are you okay?" He gave her the smallest nod. Victor followed his line of sight and noticed the child watching her father like he was something more than security. like he was steady ground. "You chose this?" Victor asked, gesturing subtly to the uniform. "I chose time," Adrian replied. "With her." The answer carried no apology. Celeste looked down at the shattered crystal fragments on the floor, then back at him. Her earlier laughter felt distant now, misplaced in a room that had nearly collapsed under her aesthetic additions. Guests were beginning to filter back inside cautiously, curiosity outweighing fear. Whispers followed them. "That's him. He climbed the rig. Who is he?" Victor straightened slowly, awareness settling across his features. This wasn't just a crisis contained, it was a narrative shifting. And narratives, he understood better than most, were power. He turned toward the terrace doors where donors and board members stood waiting for reassurance. Then he looked back at Adrian. "Stay," Victor said quietly. Not as an order, as acknowledgement. Because the night wasn't finished yet. And neither was the reckoning. "Stay," Victor had said. Adrian stayed. The word settled between them as emergency responders completed their final checks and confirmed what everyone now understood: the immediate danger had passed, but the margin had been razor thin. Staff began sweeping shattered crystal into quiet piles, the sound of bristles against marble strangely intimate in the hushed ballroom. Guests trickled back inside in cautious clusters. No music played. No laughter returned. The room felt altered, as if the air itself had learned something it couldn't forget. Victor stepped onto the slightly scuffed dance floor and raised a hand, not for applause, but for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady but stripped of performance, "there was a structural issue caused by a late installation adjustment. It has been stabilized. No one was harmed." A murmur moved through the crowd. He continued, "And that outcome is not luck." His gaze shifted deliberately to the man standing near the ladder. Heads followed. Celeste felt it immediately, the turn of energy, the direction of recognition. Her jaw tightened. Adrian stood where power never looked, near the service corridor threshold, beside maintenance equipment and a coiled extension cord. Not centered. Not spotlighted. Victor beckoned him forward with a subtle gesture. He hesitated only long enough to glance at Isla through the glass doors again. She had pressed her palm to the window, watching everything. When he stepped toward the center of the room, she straightened instinctively, as if she sensed something larger than the moment. He crossed the ballroom floor quietly, the same floor where he had been mocked less than an hour ago. Victor addressed the guests again. This evening's near disaster was identified early and contained by someone who understood exactly how little room for error we had. Celeste's pulse ticked upward. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she couldn't tell whether it was anger or something more fragile. Victor turned slightly. "Many of you know I don't make public statements lightly. But credit matters." He faced Adrian fully now. "You warned us," Victor said, voice carrying clearly across crystal and glass. "You assessed what others dismissed." Adrian shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the spotlight but not retreating from it. "I did my job," he replied simply. A few guests exchanged looks. That answer wasn't defensive, it wasn't boastful, it was factual. Celeste stepped forward abruptly. "Dad, this doesn't need to become." Victor's glance stopped her mid-sentence. "Yes," he said evenly, "it does." The word landed heavier than any chandelier. He turned back to the crowd. "Years ago, a strategist advised my company during a high-risk expansion. He identified weaknesses none of us wanted to see. We listened selectively." A pause. That was a mistake. Whispers rose again. Adrian felt the weight of memory press briefly against his chest, boardrooms, projections, quiet warnings met with polished smiles. He had learned then that wealth often confuses confidence with immunity. Victor continued, tonight, that same mind prevented what would have been catastrophic. Celeste stared at Adrian, her earlier laughter echoing painfully in her own memory now. The image of him on the ladder replayed in her thoughts, focused, unflinching, unafraid. The room had seen it too. Public memory was shifting shape. A board member near the terrace doors spoke up. "You said structural issue. Was this negligence?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the dismantled floral extension lying against the wall, the decorative enhancement Celeste had insisted upon that afternoon. Last-minute aesthetic decisions, Victor said carefully, altered load distribution beyond recommended limits. It wasn't an accusation. But it wasn't vague either. Celeste felt the implication like a blade sliding under silk. Adrian watched the exchange without expression. This wasn't about humiliation for him. It was about correction. Balance restored. He noticed Isla slipping back inside quietly, guided by the sitter but no longer fearful. She moved closer to the perimeter, eyes never leaving her father. Victor saw her too. "You chose to leave corporate consulting," Victor said to Adrian, voice softer now but still public, after personal loss. He nodded once. "And you're here," Victor continued, working security. "I'm here," Adrian replied, working. The distinction mattered. A ripple of subdued admiration passed through the guests. The simplicity of that answer contrasted sharply with the extravagance surrounding them. Celeste inhaled slowly, something inside her recalibrating. She had reduced him to uniform and proximity, to background, to inconvenience. Now the narrative was rewriting itself before witnesses. Victor stepped closer to Adrian, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearby could hear clearly, but not enough to hide it. "I owe you more than acknowledgement," Victor said. Adrian shook his head slightly. "You owe the room transparency." Another precise answer. The chandelier above them remained still. But something else had shifted permanently, and everyone in that ballroom could feel it. The ballroom held its breath even after the chandelier stopped moving. Victor remained beside Adrian at the center of the floor, the weight of 100 watching eyes pressing in from every angle. The donors, the board members, the media guests who had come for photos and philanthropy, they were no longer murmuring about decor. They were measuring character. "You're right," Victor said at last, voice carrying again. Transparency. He turned slowly, scanning the room that had once bent toward his authority without question. The additional installation that compromised the load capacity was approved this afternoon without structural review. A quiet shock rippled outward. Celeste felt it hit her like cold water. "It was my recommendation," she said suddenly, stepping forward before she could reconsider. The words came tight but clear. The florist suggested a fuller canopy for visual impact. I approved it. The confession hung in the air, not dramatic, not tearful, but undeniable. Victor studied her carefully. Pride warred with something else in her posture, fear perhaps, or dawning understanding. Adrian didn't look at her. He was watching the exits, the staff, the responders finishing their last checks. Even now he thought in layers, contingency upon contingency. "If we're reopening the floor later," he said evenly, "the rigging needs full recalibration and external inspection. No cosmetic fixes." Victor nodded without hesitation. "It'll be done." A board member cleared his throat. "We should consider postponing the remainder of the evening." Another donor added, "The optics." "The optics," Victor interrupted gently, "are that someone prevented a tragedy." His gaze shifted back to Adrian again. And the room followed. If you've made it this far and you believe humility is stronger than image, subscribe now, because this night isn't finished teaching its lesson. Celeste exhaled slowly. The sound barely reached anyone else, but Adrian heard it. He heard the crack in composure that pride rarely allows. "I shouldn't have laughed," she said, not to the room, but to him. He turned his head slightly. Her voice wasn't sharp now. It wasn't performative. It was smaller. "You saw something I didn't," she continued. "And I dismissed it." He held her gaze for a quiet moment. "Load doesn't announce itself," he replied. "It accumulates." The words carried more meaning than metal and bolts. Victor felt that too. Guests began to reposition, forming looser circles rather than rigid clusters. The emergency responders packed up equipment. Maintenance removed the last of the fallen crystal fragments. The ballroom, though altered, felt stable again. But stability required confirmation. Adrian moved toward the maintenance station near the service corridor. "I'll walk the grid once more," he said. Victor frowned. "You've done enough. Enough isn't the same as complete." Without waiting for approval, he retrieved a flashlight and headed toward the access stairs. The movement was instinctive, returning to the edges where truth lived. Celeste watched him go. Her earlier certainty now felt thin. She replayed her own laughter in her mind and found no humor in it. Victor stepped closer to her. "Leadership isn't aesthetic," he said quietly. "It's responsibility." She swallowed. "I know." Outside, Hila pressed against the glass again, watching her father disappear into the maintenance stairwell. She didn't understand corporate dynamics or public humiliation. She understood only that when things shook, he climbed toward the danger instead of away from it. Minutes later, he re-emerged from the stairwell. "Primary anchor stabilized," he reported. "Secondary brace reinforced. It'll hold until a full team inspects it." Victor nodded, relief and something resembling respect settling firmly across his features. "Then we'll finish the evening," Victor said thoughtfully, but differently. He turned toward the band, which had remained silent since the evacuation. "Soft music," he instructed. "No dancing yet." The first tentative notes floated into the air, gentle, restrained. Guests slowly re-entered the ballroom perimeter, no longer careless in their steps. The dance floor remained mostly empty, a wide expanse of polished marble reflecting the repaired chandelier above. Celeste stood still in the center of it. For the first time that night, she didn't look like the most powerful person in the room. She looked reflective. And when she finally lifted her eyes toward Adrian again, the expression there was no longer dismissive. It was searching. The narrative had shifted publicly. But something more personal was still unresolved, and Victor knew exactly how to resolve it. He didn't announce it immediately. He let the soft music settle first, low strings drifting carefully through the air, as if even the band understood that bravado had no place here anymore. The chandelier above held steady, newly reinforced, its crystals catching light without arrogance. Guests stood in quiet clusters, watching the space where panic had lived less than an hour ago. Adrian remained near the service corridor, not reclaiming the center, not lingering where attention hovered. He spoke briefly about maintenance, confirming torque readings, double-checking tension distribution. Even now, he trusted numbers more than applause. Celeste watched him from the dance floor. Her heels rested against marble that had nearly become a fault line. She replayed her own voice from earlier, light, mocking, careless. The sound made her stomach tighten. Across the room, a senior board member approached Victor. "We need to manage the narrative," the man whispered. "The press can't spin this into negligence." Victor's gaze didn't waver. "The narrative is simple," he replied. "A risk was identified. It was corrected. And the additions?" The board member pressed quietly. Victor's expression cooled. "We will document them accurately." The board member glanced toward Celeste, then back at Victor. He understood truth had weight too. Meanwhile, a veteran engineer who had assisted with the brace adjustment stepped closer to Adrian. The man studied him with open curiosity now, no longer seeing uniform first. "You said you walk the grid before doors opened," the engineer said quietly. "Most security teams don't even request access." "I requested it," Adrian replied. "And when they said no, I walked it anyway." The engineer let out a soft breath of appreciation. "That's risk assessment thinking." He nodded once. "You ever run large-scale operations?" the engineer asked. "Yes. How large?" He paused. "Large enough that chandeliers weren't the biggest concern." The engineer's brows lifted slightly. "Figures." Their exchange was quiet, but not unnoticed. Two nearby staff members leaned in just enough to hear fragments. Words like operations, risk assessment, large scale began to travel through hushed corridors of conversation. Reputation doesn't always arrive through announcements. Sometimes it leaks through credibility. Celeste caught part of it too. She stepped closer, no longer flanked by donors, no longer buffered by laughter. "You were head of logistical risk assessment?" she asked carefully. He looked at her, not unkindly, not accusingly. "For a while." "Why leave that?" She pressed. "You could have." "Time," he said simply. "Matters." She followed his glance instinctively toward the glass doors, where Isla now stood just inside the ballroom entrance, permitted closer as the room stabilized. The child's gaze was steady, unwavering. Celeste felt something unfamiliar twist inside her chest. Earlier, she had reduced him to a job title. Now the room was reducing her certainty. Victor stepped forward again, drawing attention with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, the music lowering in response. Tonight was a reminder. The crowd shifted toward him. "A reminder that brilliance isn't always dressed in spotlight," he continued. "And leadership isn't always seated at the head table." His words moved through the ballroom with deliberate weight. Adrian stood still, resisting the urge to retreat further into the edges. Victor turned slightly. "Some of you have asked who identified the structural risk before it escalated." He gestured toward him. "Years ago, this man advised my company during one of our most volatile expansions. He warned us then about overextension for the sake of image." A ripple passed through the board members. "I did not fully appreciate the value of that caution at the time," Victor admitted. "Tonight, I do." The admission landed deeper than applause ever could. Celeste's breath caught. Public acknowledgement. Not framed as charity, framed as correction. Adrian shifted his weight, uncomfortable with elevation but not denying the truth. The engineer beside him murmured under his breath, "You should be back in that world." He shook his head slightly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Across the ballroom, a donor whispered, "That's him." "The one who climbed the rig," another responded. "He used to consult for Marwood?" "I didn't know." Narratives were rewriting themselves in real time. Celeste stepped onto the center of the dance floor fully now. The space felt symbolic. Once her stage, now something else. Victor looked at her. There was no anger in his expression, only expectation. And she understood. The correction wasn't complete yet. Not until dignity was restored the same way it had been removed, publicly. With witnesses. The music continued softly, restrained, as if the room itself was waiting for instruction. The chandelier no longer trembled, yet no one dared test it with careless movement. The dance floor remained mostly empty, a wide circle of polished marble under newly secured crystal. Victor stepped fully into that circle. He didn't rush, he didn't dramatize, he simply stood where authority usually performed, and let silence gather. Adrian remained near the edge, half in shadow beside the service corridor entrance. He felt the shift in atmosphere again, the way he had felt the first vibration in the rigging. Something was building. Victor looked at Celeste. Leadership, he said quietly but audibly, requires humility. Her shoulders straightened, but not in defiance this time. In recognition. He turned then, not to the board, not to the donors, but toward the man in the security uniform. Adrian, Victor called. The name traveled cleanly across the ballroom. Conversation stopped. He didn't move at first. He wasn't accustomed to being summoned into the center for anything but warnings. For a fraction of a second, instinct told him to stay in the margins. That was where he worked best. That was where control lived. But this wasn't about control anymore. It was about correction. He stepped forward. Each footfall echoed softly against marble, measured and unhurried. The same floor that had nearly become a collapse now held him steady. Victor extended his hand, not in a handshake. An invitation, a subtle shift of posture, a quiet nod toward the band. The implication rippled through the room before words did. Celeste inhaled sharply. "You stabilized my foundation tonight," Victor said clearly. In more ways than one, he let that settle. "Would you honor us with a dance?" The question hung in the air like suspended crystal. Gasps didn't follow. No one laughed. They understood. Earlier, laughter had reduced him to background. Now, invitation restored him to center. Adrian felt heat rise along his collar, not embarrassment but the weight of public gaze. He glanced once toward the glass doors. Hila stood there, eyes wide, hands pressed against the pane. He saw pride in her face. That decided it. He took Victor's offered hand, not as a subordinate, not as a spectacle, but as an equal acknowledging respect. "I don't usually dance at work," he said quietly. A few restrained smiles flickered around the room. Victor's lips curved faintly. "Tonight isn't usual." The band shifted, strings rising into something warm and measured. Celeste stepped back from the center, giving space without being asked. Her expression was no longer sharp. It was thoughtful, almost reverent. Victor guided him onto the center of the dance floor. They didn't perform elaborate steps, no dramatic spins, no theatrics. Just a simple, steady rhythm. Two men moving in quiet acknowledgement under crystal that no longer threatened. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about balance. Around them, guests watched in silence. Some with admiration, some with discomfort, some with the dawning awareness that status had limits, and character did not. Victor leaned slightly closer as they moved. "I should have recognized you sooner," he murmured. "You weren't looking at the ceiling," Adrian replied. A faint exhale of understanding left Victor's chest. Celeste observed the exchange, replaying her earlier dismissal in painful contrast to what she now witnessed. The man she had mocked moved with composure, not triumph. There was no smirk on his face, no attempt to savor humiliation reversed. Just steadiness. That steadiness cut deeper than anger ever could. At the edge of the ballroom, Hila slipped inside fully now, the sitter trailing behind but no longer holding her back. She stepped onto the marble cautiously, drawn toward the center by something larger than music. Adrian saw her approaching. Without breaking rhythm, he shifted slightly, guiding the motion so that when the song softened, he stepped back and extended his hand toward her. A quiet ripple moved through the guests. Hila placed her small hand in his. Victor stepped aside immediately, yielding the center without hesitation. Father and daughter stood beneath the chandelier that had nearly fallen. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. He knelt slightly to match her height. "See?" He murmured. "It holds." She smiled, trusting him completely. And when they swayed together under crystal light, the room didn't see a security guard. They saw a man who climbed toward danger and returned with dignity intact. The correction was complete, public, undeniable, balanced. The music softened into its final notes, and applause rose, not explosive, not performative, but sustained. It wasn't the kind reserved for spectacle. It was the kind offered when something inside a room has been rearranged. Adrian straightened slowly, Isla's small hand still in his. The chandelier above them gleamed with steady light, no tremor, no warning hum, just crystal and reflection. Victor stepped forward again, but this time without command in his posture. He addressed the room with the quiet authority of someone who had learned something in public. Tonight, he said, we were reminded that strength isn't volume. It isn't a title. It isn't wealth. He paused, eyes drifting toward his daughter. It's awareness. It's my responsibility. And it's the courage to step forward when stepping forward isn't glamorous. The words settled deeper than earlier praise. Celeste moved closer, heels softer now against the marble. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing. She looked directly at Adrian. I was wrong, she said clearly enough for those nearby to hear. There was no dramatic tremble in her voice, just acknowledgement. I laughed, she continued. And I dismissed you. I thought I understood the room better than you did. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, aware they had laughed too. He didn't rescue her from the moment. He let it stand. You didn't understand the weight, he replied evenly. The metaphor hung there. She nodded slowly. I didn't. Victor studied both of them, then addressed the wider circle again. We built foundations in steel and stone, he said, but tonight our real foundation stood in a uniform most of us overlooked. Silence followed, not empty, but reflective. One of the board members stepped forward, clearing his throat. Mr. Vale, he said cautiously, using the last name now with deliberate respect, would you consider consulting again? Even part-time? The offer was public. Measured. Adrian glanced down at Ela, who looked up at him with absolute certainty that whatever he chose would be right. I appreciate that, he said carefully. But my priorities are already set. He squeezed her hand lightly. I work where I'm needed. The answer wasn't defiance. It was alignment. The engineer from earlier spoke up quietly. You were needed tonight. A murmur of agreement followed. Celeste stepped closer still, lowering her voice so only he and Victor could hear clearly. If you ever decide to re-enter that world, she said, I won't underestimate you again. He met her gaze. I don't need you to, he replied. Just don't underestimate the next person. That landed harder than anything else had. Across the ballroom, staff members who had once moved invisibly now stood straighter. Waiters. Coordinators. Maintenance techs. They had watched the shift in narrative too. They had seen someone from their side of the line step into the center and remain intact. Victor extended his hand once more, not for dance, not for show. For saving my guests, he said simply. Adrian took it. For listening, he answered. Outside, city lights shimmered through the glass walls. Inside, the tension that had defined the evening had dissolved into something steadier. Respect earned, not assigned. Guests began dispersing gradually, not in the careless rush of earlier, but with thoughtful glances toward the security supervisor they had once overlooked. Celeste lingered near the dance floor watching father and daughter walk toward the lobby together. There was no bitterness in her expression now, only contemplation. Victor joined her at her side. You saw the ceiling, he said quietly. She nodded. And you saw him. Another nod. Leadership, Victor added, is noticing both. Adrian paused near the glass doors, crouching slightly to speak with Isla before stepping out. Her small voice carried faintly back into the ballroom. You weren't scared, she said. He smiled faintly. I was careful. That distinction mattered. They stepped through the doors into the cool night air. Inside, the chandelier glowed calmly above a dance floor that had become something more than decoration. It had become proof that dignity doesn't require volume, that expertise doesn't need spotlight, and that sometimes the strongest foundation in the room is the one everyone laughed at first. The gala would be remembered for its near collapse, but more than that, it would be remembered for who held it up. The glass doors closed softly behind Adrian and Isla, sealing the ballroom's glow inside, while cool night air brushed across their faces. City lights stretched endlessly beyond the hotel steps, reflections rippling in the river below. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Inside, the music resumed, not triumphant, not indulgent, just steady. Isla slipped her hand into his again as they walked toward the curb where the sitter waited. They were looking at you, she said quietly. He glanced down at her. Were they? Yes. She tilted her head thoughtfully, not like before. He understood what she meant. Earlier, the looks had been dismissive, curious at best, amused at worst. Now they carried weight, respect. Behind them, through the tall windows, he could see Victor speaking to a cluster of board members. Celeste stood nearby, no longer commanding attention with laughter, but listening. Really listening. Narratives don't just shift in rooms, they ripple outward. He felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. He checked it briefly. Thank you, VM. No embellishment, no corporate flourish, just acknowledgement. He slid the phone back into his pocket without responding. Inside the ballroom, Victor raised a final glass, not for spectacle this time, but for sincerity. Tonight, he told the remaining guests, we learned that humility strengthens foundations more than marble ever could. Celeste watched the door through which Adrian had exited. The marble floor beneath her heels felt different now. Less like a stage, more like ground. I shouldn't have needed a crisis to see it, she murmured. Victor didn't disagree. Outside, the city hummed softly. Traffic moved. Sirens faded in the distance. The world continued, unaware of how close a chandelier had come to rewriting headlines. Adrian crouched slightly beside Isla before they reached the car. You were brave, he told her. I wasn't brave, she replied seriously. You were. He smiled faintly. Being careful looks like bravery sometimes, she considered that, then nodded as if committing it to memory. The sitter opened the car door. Isla climbed inside but paused before closing it. Daddy? Yeah, when I grow up I'm going to look at the ceiling too. A quiet laugh escaped him, not loud, not showy, just real. Good, he said. That's where the cracks start. She shut the door gently. He stood there for a moment longer, watching the ballroom lights flicker against glass. He could feel the night settling back into normalcy. The adrenaline had faded, the tension had dissolved. But something permanent remained. Dignity restored publicly has a different weight than private validation. It travels. It corrects narratives beyond the room where it began. Inside, Celeste finally stepped onto the dance floor again, not to perform, but to understand the space that had nearly betrayed her assumptions. She looked up at the chandelier, really looked, tracing the lines of support and suspension. Load doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. She exhaled slowly. Victor joined her once more. We'll schedule the inspection team first thing in the morning, he said. Yes, she replied. Then, after a beat, and the scholarship fund? He studied her. What about it? Expand it, she said, for technical education. Risk assessment, structural engineering. People who look at ceilings. Victor's expression softened. That, he said quietly, would be appropriate. Outside, Adrian slid into the driver's seat of his modest car. As he started the engine, he glanced once more at the towering hotel behind him. Crystal and glass, power and image. He didn't resent it. He simply understood it. The strongest structures are the ones that account for stress before it's visible. He pulled away from the curb, city lights trailing behind him like distant stars. Inside the ballroom, the gala continued, different now. Quieter, grounded. And somewhere between crystal light and marble floor, a lesson had settled permanently. Never laugh at the one who sees the ceiling shift. Because when everything starts to fall, he might be the only one who knows how to hold it up. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad took a night shift cleaning offices, not knowing the CEO was watching the cameras. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?